Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, a name few outside specialist circles now recognize, would come to be known across the globe by his revolutionary alias, Lenin. He remains one of the most talked about, revered, and reviled figures in all of history, a man whose life irrevocably altered the course of a vast nation and sent tremors through the entire 20th century. In this deep dive, we will follow Lenin from his unassuming beginnings in the late 1800s through the turbulent world he inhabited, the radical choices he made, and the profound, often brutal, legacy he left behind. People still debate the very essence of his famous call to action: all power to the Soviets. In this story, we will see what that sentence really meant for Lenin and for the life he actually lived, and why his actions and ideas still matter now. If you enjoy long, deep dives into lives and stories like this, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more. To understand the man who would become Lenin, we must first look to the small provincial city of Simbirsk, a quiet outpost on the Volga River in the heart of the Russian Empire. It was here that Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov entered the world on the 22nd of April in the year 1870. This date, based on the Gregorian calendar used today, corresponded to the 10th of April according to the older Julian calendar, then still in use across Russia. He was the third of 6 children born to Ilya Nikolaevich Ulyanov, a respected senior civil servant and school inspector, and Maria Alexandrovna Blank, the daughter of a physician. This family background, though not aristocratic, was firmly within the educated middle class, a world away from the peasantry Lenin would later claim to champion. The year of his birth was marked by a particularly severe climate, a stark reflection of the often unforgiving land he would one day seek to transform. A notably dry autumn in 1869 had paved the way for a bitterly cold winter, where temperatures frequently plummeted to below -30 degrees Celsius. Such extreme conditions were not uncommon in Russia, but they underscore the harsh realities of life in the empire, where survival often demanded immense resilience. This environmental backdrop perhaps subtly foreshadowed the immense struggles and the iron will that would come to define Ulyanov's journey, shaping a worldview where hardship was a constant, almost expected companion. As he moved into his early 20s, Vladimir Ilyich, having already embraced revolutionary ideals, became deeply involved in clandestine political activities. The year 1895 marked a critical turning point as he, along with other like-minded intellectuals, was preparing to launch a new communist newspaper, envisioned as a vital tool for galvanizing the working class. This publication was to be called The Workers' Cause, a direct translation of Rabbiki Dilo, which itself would become an influential journal later. This undertaking was more than just journalism. It was a strategic move to disseminate Marxist ideology, to educate the proletariat, and to forge a unified revolutionary movement against the autocratic czarist regime. The very act of preparing such a newspaper in an era of strict censorship was an act of profound defiance. However, the czarist state was far from blind to the rising tide of dissent. The political climate was one of constant surveillance and repression, with the notorious Russian secret police, known as the Okhrana, ever vigilant. The Okhrana were a sophisticated and ruthless internal security force, skilled in infiltration and intelligence gathering, whose primary mission was to protect the imperial regime from revolutionary threats. They quickly identified the nascent Communist Party, of which Ulyanov was a leading figure, as a significant danger. Consequently, the workers' cause never saw the light of day in its intended form, as the Okhrana moved swiftly, arresting several of its key leaders, including Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov himself, effectively crippling the group's immediate efforts to publish their subversive message. This encounter with the Okhrana would be just the first of many for the young revolutionary, marking his formal entry into the life of political exile and underground struggle. This encounter with the Okhrana would be just the first of many for the young revolutionary, marking his formal entry into the life of political exile and underground struggle. Yet to truly understand the trajectory of this man who would come to be known globally as Lenin, one must first look back to his beginnings, long before the revolutionary fervor took hold. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov was born on the 22nd of April, 1870, according to the Gregorian calendar, or the 10th of April by the Julian calendar then in use in Russia. His birthplace was Simbirsk, a picturesque town nestled on the banks of the Volga River. He was the third of 6 children born to Ilya Nikolaevich Ulyanov, a respected education official, and Maria Alexandrovna Blank, a cultured and intelligent woman. The Ulyanov household was one of intellectual curiosity and stern moral principles, a milieu that fostered a deep love for learning and a strong sense of social justice in young Vladimir. His father, a diligent and dedicated man, had worked his way up through the educational system, eventually rising to the position of director of public schools for Simbirsk province, a role that brought him nobility and a comfortable, if not extravagant, lifestyle. This exposure to the bureaucratic machinery of the Tsarist state, however, also revealed its inherent inequalities and the widespread poverty that plagued the Russian peasantry, a contrast that would deeply imprint itself on the sensitive mind of the future revolutionary. His early life was relatively privileged compared to the vast majority of Russians. The family owned a modest estate, and the children received an excellent education, often tutored at home by their mother, who spoke several languages and was well versed in literature and music. Vladimir was an exceptionally bright student, excelling in Latin and Greek, and showing a remarkable capacity for critical thought from an early age. Yet, beneath this veneer of academic success and middle-class comfort, the currents of discontent were already stirring. The late 19th century in Russia was a period of intense social and political upheaval, characterized by the lingering aftershocks of serf emancipation, rapid industrialization, and a deeply entrenched autocratic regime that resisted meaningful reform. Radical ideas, imported from Western Europe, found fertile ground among the intelligentsia, particularly within the university circles that Vladimir would eventually join. The first profound tragedy to shatter the Ulyanov family's tranquility, and arguably a pivotal moment in Vladimir's radicalization, occurred in 1886 with the sudden death of his father. Ilya Nikolaevich's passing left a gaping void, not just emotionally but also financially, as the family's pension was significantly reduced. The following year, 1887, brought an even more devastating blow that would irrevocably alter Vladimir's destiny. His elder brother, Alexander, a brilliant student and promising scientist, was arrested and subsequently executed for his involvement in a plot to assassinate Emperor Alexander III. Alexander Ulyanov was a member of the Narodnaya Volya, People's Will, a revolutionary terrorist organization. The shock of this event reverberated through the family and deeply affected Vladimir. He was just 17 at the time, and the injustice of his brother's fate, coupled with the brutal repression that followed, instilled in him a profound sense of outrage and a burning desire for systemic change. While many might have been deterred by such a tragedy, Vladimir seemed to draw strength from it, hardening his resolve and solidifying his conviction that only radical action could dismantle the oppressive Tsarist system. Following his brother's execution, Vladimir enrolled at Kazan University to study law, but his time there was short-lived. His revolutionary sympathies quickly became apparent, and he was expelled for participating in student protests, deemed unreliable by the authorities. This expulsion marked his formal entry into the world of active political dissent. For the next few years, he continued his legal studies independently, eventually earning his degree in 1891 from St. Petersburg University, though he was not permitted to attend classes in person. During this period, he immersed himself in revolutionary literature, particularly the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, which provided him with a theoretical framework for understanding the social and economic injustices he witnessed. He devoured their analyses of capitalism, class struggle, and the inevitability of socialist revolution, finding in them not just an explanation for Russia's woes, but a detailed blueprint for their ultimate resolution. It was during these formative years, often spent in isolated intellectual pursuits, that the harsh realities of the Russian climate would occasionally underscore the general hardships faced by the populace. A particularly dry autumn might be followed by a bitterly cold winter, where temperatures routinely dropped to below 30 degrees Celsius. Such extreme conditions were not just a minor inconvenience. They compounded the struggles of the peasantry, impacting harvests and making survival a relentless daily battle. While the Ulyanov family, even after their misfortunes, was relatively insulated from the worst of these effects, the general suffering caused by such severe weather, year after year, served as a stark backdrop to Vladimir's growing political consciousness. It was a tangible manifestation of the oppressive conditions that revolutionary change aimed to alleviate. Having completed his legal studies, Ulyanov spent some time practicing law in Samara, primarily defending impoverished peasants, an experience that further solidified his understanding of the exploitation inherent in the existing social structure. However, his true calling lay not in legal defense but in revolutionary agitation and organization. By the mid-1890s, he had moved to St. Petersburg, Russia's capital, and a hotbed of intellectual and revolutionary activity. There, he quickly established himself as a prominent figure among Marxist circles, distinguishing himself through his sharp intellect, his uncompromising commitment to revolutionary principles, and his exceptional organizational skills. He engaged in intense study, debate, and writing, producing early polemics against the Narodniks populists, whose agrarian socialist views he believed were outdated and ineffective compared to the scientific socialism of Marxism. He passionately argued for the necessity of an industrial proletariat as the vanguard of the revolution, a key departure from the Narodniks' focus on the peasantry. He dedicated himself to uniting the disparate Marxist groups in St. Petersburg, recognizing the need for a cohesive, disciplined organization to effectively challenge the Tsarist regime. This endeavor culminated in the formation of the League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class in 1895. The League sought to merge theoretical Marxist propaganda with practical agitation among the factory workers, distributing leaflets, organizing strikes, and educating the working class on their historical role in the coming revolution. It was this group, driven by Ulyanov's tireless energy and clear vision, that began making preparations to publish the workers' cause, a newspaper intended to serve as a vital tool for disseminating their revolutionary message and organizing the burgeoning working-class movement. His activities, however, did not go unnoticed by the omnipresent Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police, whose network of informants and agents was vast and efficient. They had been monitoring the rise of socialist groups with increasing alarm, viewing any challenge to the autocratic order, especially one led by a figure as intellectually formidable and organizationally capable as Ulyanov, as a significant danger. The swift arrests that followed the Okhrana's intervention, effectively crippling the workers' cause before it could truly begin, merely confirmed their assessment of his potential. His subsequent imprisonment and eventual Siberian exile were not deterrents, but rather catalysts, hardening his resolve and sharpening his revolutionary theory. This period of forced isolation, far from breaking his spirit, provided him with invaluable time to read, write, and refine his ideas, setting the stage for his eventual emergence as one of the most significant and controversial figures of the 20th century. The first chapter explored the early life and radicalization of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known to history as Lenin, and the burgeoning revolutionary fervor in Russia. As the early years of the 20th century progressed, a series of grievances, from land hunger to industrial exploitation and devastating military defeats, simmered beneath the surface of Tsarist autocracy. This discontent reached a fever pitch in late 1904, leading to a monumental clash. On the 22nd of January, 1905, a procession of several thousand unarmed workers marched on the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, the official residence of Tsar Nicholas II. They sought to present a petition, a plea for basic human rights, better working conditions, and a measure of political freedom. This was a direct appeal to the Tsar, whom many still viewed as a benevolent, if distant, father figure. Instead of an audience, the peaceful demonstration was met with military force, as Imperial Guard troops opened fire on the crowd, killing hundreds and wounding thousands. This day, forever etched into Russian memory as Bloody Sunday, shattered the ancient illusion of a caring monarch and ignited a wave of strikes and uprisings across the empire, marking the onset of the 1905 revolution. What began as an appeal to authority ended in its brutal repudiation, demonstrating a fundamental breakdown in the relationship between ruler and ruled. In the face of widespread unrest, which included mass strikes, peasant revolts, and even mutinies within the armed forces, Tsar Nicholas II was compelled to make concessions. In October of that year, he issued the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties and the establishment of an elected legislative assembly, the State Duma. However, once the immediate threat subsided, Nicholas reneged on most of these promises. While a State Duma was indeed established, its powers were severely limited, often dismissed or dissolved by the Tsar at will. Real political authority remained firmly in the hands of the autocracy. This pattern of promising reform only to retract it underscored the regime's deep-seated resistance to any genuine dilution of its power, leaving the fundamental issues unresolved and resentment festering. The Tsar had offered a glimpse of freedom, only to snatch it away, deepening the sense of betrayal. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, observing these events from their various points of exile, carefully considered their options and the profound implications. The revolution of 1905 had clearly been a false dawn, a powerful explosion of popular will that ultimately failed to overthrow the existing order. For Lenin, this failure was not without its lessons. He saw in the widespread, spontaneous nature of the protests both a strength and a weakness. It proved that the masses possessed revolutionary potential, but also revealed the critical absence of a disciplined, unified, and ideologically coherent vanguard party capable of leading them to victory. The experience reinforced his conviction that spontaneous uprisings alone were insufficient. A meticulously organized and strategically directed party was indispensable for a successful revolution. This was not a moment for despair, but for rigorous analysis and tactical refinement. As the Tsarist regime regained its footing and unleashed a wave of repression, the revolutionary movement was once again driven underground. Many of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party leaders, including Lenin and other prominent Bolsheviks, were forced to head into exile. They scattered further to the west, finding refuge in countries like Britain, Switzerland, and France, where they could continue their political organizing and theoretical work, albeit from a distance. This period of forced exile was not merely a retreat. It was an opportunity for intense ideological debate, the publication of revolutionary literature, and the meticulous planning for the next, inevitable, revolutionary wave. The cat-and-mouse game with the Tsarist secret police, known as the Okhrana, became a constant feature of their lives, shaping their clandestine methods and strengthening their resolve for the future. The meticulous planning for the next, inevitable, revolutionary wave found its unforeseen catalyst on the 22nd of January that year, a date that would forever be seared into the collective memory of the Russian people. On that fateful Sunday, a procession of several thousand unarmed workers marched on the Tsar's winter palace in St. Petersburg. Led by Father Gapon, a charismatic priest, they carried icons and portraits of the Tsar, intending to present a humble petition for improved working conditions, civil liberties, and an end to the Russo-Japanese War. Their belief in the Tsar as a benevolent father figure, albeit misled by corrupt officials, was profound. But the response they met was not one of paternal understanding, it was one of brutal repression. Tsarist troops opened fire on the peaceful demonstrators, turning the snow-covered streets crimson with blood. Hundreds were killed and thousands wounded in what quickly became known as Bloody Sunday. The massacre shattered the myth of the benevolent Tsar and ignited a firestorm of outrage across the empire. Strikes erupted in cities and towns, peasants rebelled in the countryside, and mutinies spread within the armed forces. The next revolutionary wave had arrived, not as a carefully orchestrated plan, but as a spontaneous eruption of popular fury. For months, Russia teetered on the brink of complete societal collapse. The sheer scale and intensity of the unrest, culminating in the October general strike, forced Nicholas II to make concessions. In October 1905, he issued the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties and the establishment of an elected legislative assembly, the State Duma. It seemed for a fleeting moment that the autocracy had bowed to the will of the people. Exiles, including many from the RSDRP, cautiously began to return, eager to participate in the burgeoning political landscape. However, thereafter, Nicholas reneged on most of his promises. While a State Duma was established, Nicholas II swiftly moved to curb its powers, ensuring it remained little more than a consultative body. He promulgated the fundamental state laws of 1906, effectively reaffirming his autocratic authority and declaring that supreme autocratic power belongs to the Emperor of all Russia. The electoral system was manipulated to favor the landed gentry and conservative elements, disenfranchising a large segment of the urban working class and peasantry. Repression followed the brief thaw as the government cracked down on dissent, dissolved two Duma in quick succession, and introduced harsh martial law in many areas. Lenin and the Bolsheviks considered their options. From their vantage point, the revolution of 1905 had clearly been a false dawn. It had exposed the deep-seated grievances within Russian society and the Tsarist regime's brutal unwillingness to fundamentally reform. It had also provided invaluable lessons in revolutionary tactics, particularly the power of mass strikes and the potential for a united workers' movement. Yet it had also demonstrated the limitations of spontaneous action and the incomplete political consciousness of the masses, many of whom still harbored illusions about the Tsar. For Lenin, 1905 was a dress rehearsal, a crucial learning experience that underscored the necessity of a disciplined, vanguard party to lead the proletariat. The party's analysis concluded that the 1905 revolution failed because it lacked a strong, unified revolutionary leadership, a firm worker-peasant alliance, and the full support of the armed forces. It was a premature explosion, ultimately contained by the Tsarist regime's resilience and its ability to regain control through a combination of limited concessions and widespread repression. The aftermath of 1905 brought a new wave of arrests and government crackdowns, making organized political activity within Russia increasingly perilous. The brief period of open political engagement quickly evaporated. Consequently, once again, the RSDRP leaders would head into exile, further to the west in countries like Britain, Switzerland, France, and Germany. These nations, with their relatively more liberal political climates, offered a haven from the Okhrana's direct reach, although the threat of infiltration and surveillance remained a constant concern. This second period of exile, often referred to as the Years of Reaction, 1907–1914, saw the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks continue their intense internal debates, further solidifying their distinct ideological paths. Lenin, from his various European bases, relentlessly attacked the liquidators, those who advocated for dissolving the clandestine party structure and operating solely through legal channels like the Duma and trade unions. He argued vehemently for maintaining and strengthening the illegal party apparatus, believing that the Tsarist regime would never allow genuine political freedom and that a violent overthrow was still the only viable path. He used this period to refine his theory of imperialism, viewing it as the highest stage of capitalism, and to prepare for the inevitable future conflicts, both within Russia and on the global stage, which he believed would offer new revolutionary opportunities. The Okhrana's shadow, though more distant, never fully receded, its agents meticulously tracking movements, intercepting communications, and attempting to sow discord within the émigré communities. But for Lenin and his committed followers, these years of intellectual struggle and clandestine organization were not a retreat from the revolution, but a necessary preparation for its final, decisive act. By this time, Vladimir Lenin's political thought was beginning to mature, showing a clear willingness to diverge from what was then considered orthodox Marxism. Traditional Marxist theory, as understood by many European socialists, held that a socialist revolution would first occur in highly industrialized capitalist nations, where the proletariat, the industrial working class, was largest and most developed. Lenin, however, argued that Russia, despite its agrarian majority and less advanced industrial base, could serve as the weak link in the imperialist chain. He believed a disciplined vanguard party, comprising professional revolutionaries, could accelerate the historical process, seizing power on behalf of the working class and peasantry, rather than waiting for capitalism to fully mature. This strategic departure marked a significant evolution in his revolutionary vision, tailoring Marxist principles to Russian realities. The brief February Revolution had brought the Romanov dynasty to an abrupt end after 300 years of ruling Russia. Spontaneous strikes, protests, and military mutinies in Petrograd, the capital, escalated rapidly, leading to Tsar Nicholas II's abdication in March 1917. This collapse of the ancient regime did not immediately usher in a single, stable successor. Instead, a complex situation of dual power emerged with the provisional government, composed largely of liberal politicians and former Duma members, sharing authority, however uneasily, with the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies, representing the revolutionary masses. This created a volatile political landscape where competing visions for Russia's future clashed daily. Within days, the revolutionaries made some of their views and intentions known to the wider political arena. The provisional government, aiming for a democratic parliamentary system, declared civil liberties, abolished ethnic and religious discrimination, and began preparations for a constituent assembly to draft a new constitution. Yet they struggled to address the popular demands for an end to the war and for land redistribution. Lenin, upon his return to Russia in April, immediately articulated his radical April theses, calling for no support to the provisional government, immediate transfer of all state power to the Soviets, and an end to the imperialist war. His uncompromising stance shocked many, including some Bolsheviks, but effectively sharpened the political divide and galvanized his party. Just days after the Bolsheviks had seized power in Petrograd during the October Revolution, they acted decisively to affirm several core principles. One pivotal declaration, the Declaration of the Rights of the Peoples of Russia, issued in early November 1917, affirmed that all ethnic peoples within the former Russian Empire had the right to self-determination, including the right to secede and form independent states. This was a radical break from Tsarist imperial policy, and a powerful appeal to the numerous non-Russian nationalities who made up a significant portion of the population. This decree, alongside the decrees on peace and land, aimed to dismantle the old order, consolidate Bolshevik authority, and lay the groundwork for a new, revolutionary state built on different principles of national and social justice. The decree on nationalities, following closely on the heels of the decrees on peace and land, constituted a formidable trifecta, signaling a complete break from the past and a bold blueprint for the future. These were not mere policy adjustments. They were revolutionary acts designed to dismantle the very foundations of the old imperial state and establish the legitimacy of Bolshevik rule in its place. The stage for these seismic shifts had been set much earlier, in the tumultuous spring of 1917. The brief but decisive February Revolution, fueled by war weariness, economic hardship, and centuries of autocratic repression, had brought the Romanov dynasty to an abrupt and unceremonious end after over 300 years of ruling Russia. The fall of the Tsar had unleashed a torrent of political activity and the emergence of a dual power structure. The provisional government, composed largely of liberal and moderate socialist figures, and the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies, representing the more radical elements of the working class and the military. Within days of the Tsar's abdication, the initial revolutionaries made some of their views and intentions known to the wider political landscape, primarily advocating for civil liberties, an end to discrimination, and a more democratic system. However, the provisional government proved unable to address the core demands of the populace: peace, land, and bread, and crucially, failed to end Russia's participation in the ruinous Great War. This vacuum of decisive action and the growing disillusionment of the masses provided the fertile ground upon which the Bolsheviks, under Lenin's determined leadership, would rise. By this critical juncture, Lenin's political thought was beginning to mature beyond rigid adherence to orthodox Marxist theory. While deeply rooted in Marxist principles, he had developed a pragmatic and often audacious approach to revolution, willing to diverge from established doctrine when he perceived it necessary for the advancement of the revolutionary cause. Orthodox Marxism posited that a socialist revolution would occur in highly industrialized capitalist societies, following a fully developed bourgeois democratic phase. Russia, predominantly agrarian and semi-feudal, did not fit this model. Yet Lenin, upon his return in April 1917, famously issued his April Theses, calling for all power to the Soviets, and pushing for an immediate transition to a socialist revolution, bypassing the traditional bourgeois stage. This was a radical break, demonstrating his conviction that the unique circumstances of Russia, particularly the weakness of the provisional government and the strength of the worker and soldier Soviets, presented an unprecedented opportunity. The decrees on peace, land, and nationalities, enacted almost immediately after the October seizure of power, were direct manifestations of this evolving, pragmatic Leninism. They were not abstract theoretical constructs, but concrete, popular demands translated into state policy, designed to win over the broad masses and solidify the Bolshevik position against their myriad opponents. The promise of immediate peace resonated with the war-weary soldiers and civilians. The redistribution of land appealed directly to the vast peasant majority, and the right to self-determination for oppressed nationalities offered a powerful counter-narrative to centuries of Imperial Russian domination. The immediate aftermath of these decrees was a mix of fervent support, cautious optimism, and fierce opposition. While they resonated deeply with many, they also provoked outrage among those who saw them as an abandonment of national duty, a threat to property, and a recipe for national disintegration. The former landowning classes, industrialists, and much of the officer corps viewed the decrees as a criminal assault on their rights and the very fabric of the state. The decree on land, in particular, legitimized a process of peasant land seizures that had already been occurring spontaneously, but now gave it official sanction, fundamentally altering the agrarian structure of the country. Similarly, the decree on peace was seen by many as a betrayal of Russia's allies in the Entente and a capitulation to Germany, yet it was undeniably popular with the war-exhausted populace. The affirmation that all ethnic peoples living within the former Russian Empire had the right to self-determination, including secession, was a particularly explosive proposition. It directly undermined the unitary structure of the Tsarist Empire and challenged the great Russian chauvinism that had long characterized state policy. For Poles, Finns, Ukrainians, Georgians, and numerous other ethnic groups who had chafed under Russian rule, this was a momentous declaration. While the Bolsheviks saw it as a tactical move to undermine imperial power and foster international solidarity among the proletariat, it also unleashed centrifugal forces that would profoundly shape the future of the region. Many of these groups, having endured generations of cultural and political suppression, seized the opportunity to declare their independence, often to the dismay of the Bolsheviks who, despite their theoretical commitment to self-determination, preferred to see these nations integrated into a broader socialist federation. The implementation of these decrees was far from smooth, leading to complex negotiations, civil war, and ultimately, the reassertion of central control, though often under the guise of federated republics within the new Soviet state. Beyond these immediate practical implications, the decrees also served as a powerful ideological statement to the world. They broadcasted the Bolshevik vision of a new international order, one built on peace, social justice, and national liberation, directly challenging the existing imperialist system. They aimed to inspire workers and oppressed peoples globally, positioning Soviet Russia as the vanguard of a worldwide revolution. This appeal to internationalism and anti-imperialism would become a cornerstone of Soviet foreign policy for decades to come, even as its practical application often diverged from its stated ideals. The sheer speed and audacity with which these fundamental changes were proclaimed demonstrated the revolutionary zeal and tactical brilliance of the Bolshevik leadership. They understood that in the chaotic aftermath of the old regime's collapse, decisive action and clear, compelling promises were paramount to securing power and reshaping the future. The decrees were not merely legal documents. They were declarations of war against the old order and the initial building blocks of a radically new one. The stage was set for a monumental struggle, both internal and external, to determine the fate of Russia, and in many respects, the future course of the 20th century. The theoretical framework of Bolshevism, now infused with Lenin's pragmatic adaptations, was being tested in the crucible of realpolitik and civil strife, laying bare both its potential for radical change and its inherent contradictions. Despite the Bolsheviks having seized power in October of 1917, their revolution was far from universally accepted across the vast Russian lands. There were, after all, other significant elements within the broader revolutionary movement in Russia, each with their own vision for the future and their own claim to legitimacy. Many socialists, including the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries, believed in a different path, one that involved a more democratic transition and broader popular support, perhaps through a constituent assembly. These groups, who had often fought alongside the Bolsheviks against the old Tsarist regime, now found themselves increasingly sidelined, their voices suppressed, and their members persecuted as the Bolsheviks consolidated a one-party state. This period was not simply a struggle against the remnants of the old order, but also a brutal internal conflict between competing visions of what a post-Tsarist Russia should be. The escalating tensions and widespread opposition to Bolshevik rule culminated in a series of violent attacks against its leaders. On the morning of the 30th of August 1918, Vladimir Lenin himself became the target of an assassination attempt. As he was leaving a factory in Moscow after a speech, a woman named Fanny Kaplan, a former member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, fired several shots. Lenin was seriously wounded, struck by 2 bullets, one in the shoulder and another near his lung. This event, occurring amidst other acts of terror, solidified the Bolsheviks' resolve to employ extreme measures. The attack served as a critical turning point, providing the catalyst for the official launch of the Red Terror, a period of intensified political repression and mass executions carried out by the Cheka, the secret police, against perceived enemies of the revolution. In the midst of this internal and external struggle, the Bolsheviks aggressively moved to transform the social and legal landscape of Russia, guided by the tenets of communist ideology. This was not merely about economic change, but a radical reshaping of human society itself. For instance, communist ideology fundamentally rejected religion, viewing it as the opium of the people, a tool used by ruling classes to pacify the masses. The new government embarked on an aggressive campaign of state atheism, closing churches, seizing religious property, and persecuting clergy. Beyond religion, traditional family structures were challenged. Divorce became easier, abortion was legalized, and women were theoretically granted equal rights, though the practical implementation often lagged behind the decrees. Education was secularized and redesigned to promote communist principles, while private property was largely abolished, and industry and land were nationalized. The state sought to dismantle every institution and belief system that did not align with its vision of a new, classless society. The urgency and often brutal nature of these transformations stemmed from a stark reality. The revolution which they had initiated in October 1917 had not been accepted by a great many elements within Russian society. From monarchists and liberals to moderate socialists, Cossacks, and various ethnic minorities, substantial factions resisted Bolshevik rule. This widespread rejection fueled the bloody Russian Civil War, which raged for several years, pitting the Bolshevik Red Army against a diverse array of white armies, often supported by foreign powers. For the Bolsheviks, holding onto power meant not just winning battles, but also ruthlessly suppressing all dissent and enforcing their ideological program, convinced that only through a dictatorship of the proletariat could the revolution survive and ultimately triumph. This belief shaped their policies, their methods, and the very nature of the new Soviet state. However, this assertion of absolute power and the violent suppression it entailed were not universally accepted, even within the broader revolutionary movement itself. The Bolsheviks, despite their self-proclaimed vanguard role, were far from the only revolutionary force in Russia, with a legitimate claim to represent the will of the people and the future direction of the revolution. Indeed, the February Revolution of 1917 had initially brought together a wide spectrum of socialist and liberal parties. The provisional government, while short-lived, included figures from the Constitutional Democratic Party cadets, while the Soviets, the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils, were initially dominated by Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries SRs. These parties, particularly the Mensheviks and the Right SRs, adhered to different interpretations of Marxist theory or populist agrarian socialism, advocating for a multi-party socialist democracy, a more gradual transition to socialism, or a greater emphasis on peasant-based land reform. Even the left SRs, who initially allied with the Bolsheviks in the early Soviet government, quickly grew disillusioned with their authoritarian methods and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, eventually rebelling and being crushed. Anarchists, who had also played a role in the initial revolutionary fervor, likewise found themselves targets of the increasingly centralized and coercive Bolshevik state. For many of these elements, the October Revolution, rather than being the culmination of popular will, was viewed as a coup d'etat by a minority faction. They condemned the dissolution of the democratically elected Constituent Assembly in January 1918, where the socialist revolutionaries had won a clear majority, as a betrayal of revolutionary principles. Their vision of Russia's future was one of a vibrant, multi-party socialist republic, not the one-party dictatorship that the Bolsheviks were rapidly constructing. The Bolsheviks, however, saw any political opposition, regardless of its socialist credentials, as inherently counter-revolutionary and a threat to the revolution's survival. This fundamental disagreement, exacerbated by the ongoing civil war and the struggle for survival, escalated the violence and created an atmosphere of paranoia and retribution. The simmering tensions and the desperate struggle for power manifested not only on the battlefields of the Civil War, but also in targeted acts of political violence. The very existence of the Bolshevik regime was contested at every turn, not just by the white armies representing Tsarist loyalists, liberals, and foreign interests, but also by internal opposition from disillusioned socialists and ordinary citizens. It was within this volatile and existential struggle that the Bolshevik leadership itself became direct targets. The most dramatic and significant of these attempts occurred on the morning of August 30, 1918. On that day, Vladimir Lenin, the undisputed leader of the Bolshevik Party and the head of the Soviet government, was shot and severely wounded in Moscow after speaking at the Michelson factory. Concurrently, Moise Uritsky, the head of the Petrograd Cheka, the secret police, was assassinated in Petrograd. The assassination attempt on Lenin was carried out by Fanny Kaplan, a socialist revolutionary, who stated her actions were motivated by the Bolsheviks' betrayal of the revolution and the dispersal of the Constituent Assembly. This third assassination attempt on Lenin following two earlier, less severe, incidents had a profound and immediate impact. It confirmed the Bolsheviks' deepest fears about the extent of their internal enemies, and provided the ultimate justification for a brutal, systematized campaign of repression. Just days later, on September 5, 1918, the Council of People's Commissars officially decreed the Red Terror. This was not merely an escalation of existing repression, but a formal policy of class warfare, explicitly targeting suspected enemies of the revolution, including former Tsarist officials, members of the bourgeoisie, kulaks, wealthy peasants, priests, and political opponents like Mensheviks and SRs. Thousands were arrested, imprisoned, and executed without trial, often based on their social background rather than any specific crime. The Cheka, already a formidable instrument of state control, was unleashed with even greater authority, becoming a law unto itself in its mission to protect the revolution from real and imagined threats. The assassination attempt, therefore, served as a crucial turning point, solidifying the Bolsheviks' resolve to establish a totalitarian grip on power and ruthlessly eliminate all dissent. Beyond the immediate crisis of civil war and political survival, the Bolsheviks harbored a far more ambitious agenda: to fundamentally transform the social and legal landscape of Russia according to communist ideology. This was not merely about seizing political power, but about forging an entirely new society, dismantling centuries-old institutions and beliefs. Central to this vision was the rejection of religion, which communist ideology viewed as the opium of the people, a tool of oppression used by ruling classes to pacify the masses. The Orthodox Church, deeply intertwined with the Tsarist autocracy, was a particular target. The Bolsheviks immediately moved to separate church and state, confiscate church property, and persecute clergy. Religious education was banned, and public displays of faith were discouraged or outright suppressed. Churches were converted into museums, warehouses, or even simply demolished. This was a direct assault on the spiritual bedrock of Russian society, aimed at replacing religious faith with atheistic scientific materialism and devotion to the party. The transformation went far beyond religion. The Bolsheviks introduced radical changes in family law, legalizing civil marriage, divorce, and abortion in the early years, reflecting a desire to liberate individuals from traditional patriarchal structures and promote gender equality. Education was seen as a key ideological battleground, with mass literacy campaigns, likhbez, launched to spread knowledge and communist doctrine. The traditional legal system was dismantled, replaced by revolutionary tribunals and the Cheka, where class origin often determined guilt. Private property was largely abolished, land was nationalized, and industries were brought under state control. Even art and culture were expected to serve the revolution, giving rise to proletarian culture movements. This all-encompassing drive to reshape every aspect of life, from the grandest political structures to the most intimate personal beliefs, underscored the Bolsheviks' conviction that the revolution was not merely a change of government but a complete societal overhaul, a creation of a new Soviet man and a new communist world order. However, as previously mentioned, this radical vision and the methods used to implement it were met with fierce resistance. The revolution which they had initiated in October 1917 had not been accepted by a great many elements within Russian society, not just the white armies. This rejection came from diverse quarters, and for a multitude of reasons, going far beyond the political squabbles of the revolutionary parties. Peasants, who initially supported the Bolsheviks for their promise of land, often resented the forced requisitioning of grain, Prodrazvyorska, during war communism, leading to widespread peasant uprisings like the Tambov Rebellion. Workers, supposedly the bedrock of the revolution, also chafed under harsh labor discipline, food shortages, and the suppression of independent trade unions, culminating in strikes and even armed rebellions like the Kronstadt sailors' uprising in 1921. The middle classes, small business owners, intellectuals, and former Tsarist bureaucrats found themselves dispossessed, marginalized, and often persecuted. National minorities, initially promised self-determination, often found themselves under the control of a new, centralized Russian power. Their aspirations for independence were frequently crushed, as seen in the brutal suppression of independence movements in Ukraine, Georgia, and other regions. The relentless campaigns against religion alienated vast swathes of the population who clung to their traditional faith. Even within the Red Army, desertion rates were high, reflecting the popular exhaustion and disillusionment with the ongoing conflict and the severe privations of war communism. The Bolsheviks therefore faced a monumental task, not only to win a civil war against external and internal military threats, but also to impose their ideological will on a population that was diverse, often resistant, and deeply scarred by years of war and upheaval. Their victory in the Civil War was not an endorsement of their ideology by the majority, but rather a testament to their superior organization, ruthless determination, and the disunity of their opponents. The legacy of these foundational years marked by civil war, terror, ideological zeal, and profound social transformation irrevocably shaped the Soviet Union, defining its authoritarian nature, its expansionist tendencies, and its internal struggles for decades to come. The dictatorship of the proletariat rapidly evolved into a dictatorship of the party, and then increasingly, a dictatorship of a single man, laying the groundwork for the Stalinist era that would follow. The promises of a liberated, egalitarian society often gave way to coercion, fear, and scarcity, leaving many to wonder what kind of revolution had truly triumphed. Even as the struggle for survival continued across the vast Russian lands, external pressures mounted, demonstrating the precarious position of the newly formed Soviet state. In the north, a British and French expeditionary force landed at Archangel on the White Sea before the war against the Central Powers had even concluded, establishing a beachhead that symbolized the broader international opposition to the Bolshevik Revolution. This intervention aimed to support the anti-Bolshevik White Army, prevent German access to Allied war materials stored in the region, and ultimately to destabilize the communist government. The presence of these foreign troops added another layer of complexity to an already devastating civil war, forcing the Red Army to commit resources to defend its northern flank against well-equipped, if relatively small, Western forces. Within the nascent Soviet leadership, the question of succession and future direction became paramount, especially as Vladimir Ilyich Lenin himself began to fade. While Leon Trotsky was widely seen as a strong revolutionary figure, Lenin grew increasingly critical of him, particularly regarding his perceived overambition and an intellectual approach that lacked practical grounding. In his final, unvarnished assessments, Lenin expressed serious reservations about Trotsky's temperament and his ability to lead the party, suggesting that he was not adequately equipped from an intellectual or temperamental standpoint to guide the complex future of the revolution. Instead, Lenin looked to others, though his full intentions for a successor or collective leadership remained tragically unresolved, leaving a vacuum that opportunistic figures would soon exploit. Lenin died on the 21st of January, 1924, a pivotal moment that immediately ignited the political machinations to succeed him. Leon Trotsky, a brilliant orator and organizer of the Red Army, appeared to be the natural heir to the revolutionary mantle. However, he faced fierce opposition from a triumvirate of powerful party figures: Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and Joseph Stalin. This troika skillfully exploited Trotsky's perceived arrogance and his past disagreements with Lenin to sideline him, presenting themselves as the true guardians of Lenin's legacy. They strategically isolated Trotsky from key decision-making processes, ensuring he was not present at Lenin's funeral, a crucial symbolic event that underscored his growing political vulnerability. Through a series of calculated political maneuvers, Joseph Stalin, initially underestimated by his rivals, gradually outmaneuvered both Trotsky and the other members of the triumvirate. Leveraging his position as General Secretary of the Communist Party, a role he used to appoint loyalists and consolidate power within the party apparatus, Stalin systematically eliminated his opponents. He first allied with Zinoviev and Kamenev to remove Trotsky, then turned on his former allies, accusing them of factionalism and deviation from party lines. By the late 1920s, Stalin had monopolized power completely in his own hands, establishing himself as a dictator in all but name, transforming the revolutionary ideals into an authoritarian state built on absolute loyalty to himself. The internal struggle for leadership, however, was not the only crucible in which the early Soviet state was forged. The fledgling Bolshevik regime faced a myriad of external threats and domestic resistance during the brutal Russian Civil War, 1918–1922. Among these was the intervention of foreign powers, wary of the spread of communism and eager to support the White Army counter-revolutionaries. It was against this backdrop of desperate fighting and existential threat that a British and French expeditionary force landed at Archangelsk on the White Sea in August 1918, aiming to secure Allied war materiel, support anti-Bolshevik forces, and potentially open a second front against Germany in the east. This intervention, along with others in Siberia, the Caucasus, and Ukraine, underscored the profound vulnerability of the nascent Soviet state and intensified the Bolsheviks' resolve to defend their revolution against all perceived enemies, both foreign and domestic. This period of war communism forged a highly centralized, militarized party apparatus, laying groundwork that later figures like Stalin would exploit. As the Civil War drew to a close and the Soviet Union began its arduous recovery, the health of its charismatic leader, Vladimir Lenin, began to deteriorate significantly. Several strokes in the early 1920s progressively incapacitated him, removing his guiding hand from the reins of power and opening a dangerous vacuum at the top. Lenin, increasingly aware of his own mortality and concerned about the future direction of the party, penned what became known as his Testament and other critical notes in late 1922 and early 1923. In these documents, he offered shrewd character assessments of his potential successors, warning against the concentration of too much power in any one individual's hands. He famously criticized Joseph Stalin, noting his rudeness and suggesting he be removed from the post of general secretary. Crucially, he also expressed reservations about Leon Trotsky, a brilliant orator and the architect of the Red Army, claiming he was overly ambitious and poorly equipped from an intellectual standpoint to lead the party in the subtle, nuanced way required. Lenin, deeply troubled by the growing bureaucratic tendencies and internal factionalism, attempted to steer the party away from autocratic rule, but his words, delivered from a state of failing health, would ultimately be disregarded or suppressed by those vying for control. Lenin's physical decline culminated in his death on the 21st of January 1924. His passing immediately triggered the political machinations to succeed him, a ruthless struggle for control over the Soviet state and the global communist movement. Trotsky, despite his immense prestige as a revolutionary hero and military leader, found himself strategically isolated. His intellectual aloofness, his past disagreements with Lenin, albeit reconciled, and his perceived arrogance alienated many of the old Bolsheviks within the party's central committee. Furthermore, his strong advocacy for permanent revolution, the idea that socialism in Russia could only survive if revolutionary movements succeeded in advanced capitalist countries, contrasted sharply with the more pragmatic and nationally focused socialism in one country doctrine that Stalin would later champion. This ideological difference, coupled with a deliberate campaign of marginalization orchestrated by his rivals, left Trotsky vulnerable. Stalin, meanwhile, had been meticulously building his power base from his seemingly mundane position as General Secretary of the Communist Party. This role, created in 1922, allowed him to control party appointments, promotions, and transfers, giving him an unparalleled influence over the composition of local party committees and, crucially, the delegates to party congresses. While Trotsky was busy with military affairs and writing, Stalin was mastering the internal machinery of the party, filling key positions with loyalists who owed their careers to him. He understood that real power lay not in charisma or intellectual brilliance, but in the control of organization and personnel. He cultivated an image of a modest, reliable administrator, a stark contrast to Trotsky's more flamboyant and intellectual persona. The succession struggle unfolded in stages, with Stalin employing a classic divide-and-conquer strategy. Initially, he formed a troika with Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, two prominent old Bolsheviks and members of the Politburo, to effectively sideline Trotsky. They exploited Lenin's earlier criticisms of Trotsky and emphasized his Menshevik past, a rival socialist faction, portraying him as an unstable outsider despite his pivotal role in the October Revolution and Civil War. By controlling the party apparatus and orchestrating votes at party congresses, this alliance succeeded in stripping Trotsky of his political offices, first from his position as People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs in 1925, and later from the Politburo itself. Trotsky's attempts to appeal directly to the party rank and file were thwarted by censorship and the bureaucratic control of party media. His supporters were purged from positions of influence, and he himself was eventually expelled from the party in 1927, exiled to Alma-Ata in 1928, and finally deported from the Soviet Union in 1929. Once Trotsky was neutralized, Stalin swiftly turned on his former allies. Zinoviev and Kamenev, who had underestimated Stalin's ruthlessness and ambition, soon found themselves on the defensive. They had initially viewed Stalin as a useful tool to counter Trotsky's influence, believing they could control him. However, Stalin accused them of factionalism and deviation from party lines, using the very rules against internal dissent that had been strengthened during the Civil War to consolidate party unity rules that Zinoviev and Kamenev themselves had helped enforce against Trotsky. Stalin aligned with Nikolai Bukharin, a leading party theoretician and advocate for more moderate economic policies, to isolate and remove Zinoviev and Kamenev from the Politburo and Central Committee. Their careers ended ignominiously, marking a chilling precedent for future purges. By the late 1920s, Stalin had indeed monopolized power completely in his own hands, establishing himself as a dictator in all but name, transforming the revolutionary ideals of liberation and workers' power into an authoritarian state built on absolute loyalty to himself. The party, once a forum for debate, became an instrument of his will. The theoretical purity of Marxism-Leninism was reinterpreted to justify his autocratic rule, with any dissent or alternative viewpoint branded as counter-revolutionary and deserving of severe punishment. The stage was set for the imposition of forced collectivization and rapid industrialization, policies that would reshape Soviet society at immense human cost, all under the unchallengeable authority of the man who had outmaneuvered every rival to become the undisputed master of the Soviet Union. His rise from a relatively minor figure to absolute ruler was a testament to his unmatched political cunning, his ruthless efficiency in manipulating party structures, and his profound understanding of power dynamics in a one-party state, forever altering the trajectory of the Soviet experiment.